Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Finneran's Wake. I am, as always, your faithful host, Daniel Finneran. And if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to this channel, recommend it to a friend, and perhaps consider visiting my other podcast and my other channel, Pneuma by Daniel Finneran, on which we have a lot of mindfulness and meditation content. It's my honor and privilege to have a discussion with the esteemed Evan Mandery today. Professor Mandery is the author of 8 books, 3 of nonfiction, including his latest work, and the one about which we'll be talking at some length, Poison Ivy, How Elite Colleges Divide Us, available where all good books are sold, and 4 of fiction, including one entitled Dreaming of Gwen Stefani, someone to whom my own reveries are not infrequently devoted, and that's something about which I want to talk as well. Professor Mandery, or Evan Mandery, is a double Harvard graduate. He went there for his undergraduate years and also for law school, which makes him something of an expert, having been both inside and outside that institution as someone who can most aptly criticize it. His expertise is in the death penalty. He is currently a professor of ethics and law for more than 2 decades, I should say, at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice at CUNY, which is the City University of New York. And he currently resides in Montclair, New Jersey with his wife and children. Evan, thank you so very much for joining me today.
My pleasure to be here.
So I want to begin with the definition of a term. Now, in a classic volume of essays entitled The Idea of a University, the English clergyman John Henry Newman spells out, in language as lucid as it is beautiful, his definition of a university. The Anglican apostate and future Roman Catholic cardinal said, and I quote, "If I were asked to describe as briefly and as popularly as I could what a university was, I should draw my answer from its ancient designation of a studium generale, or school of universal learning. This description implies the assemblage of strangers from all parts of the country in one spot. In its simple and rudimentary form, it is a school of knowledge of every kind, consisting of teachers and learners from every quarter. It is the place in which the intellect may safely range and speculate, sure to find its equal in some antagonist activity and its judge in the tribunal of truth. It is a place where inquiry is pushed forward and discoveries verified and perfected and rashness rendered innocuous and error exposed by the collision of mind with mind and knowledge with knowledge." Evan, I pose to you the very same question with which the recently canonized John Henry Newman opened his series of essays, into which, in the foregoing passage, he eloquently put forth his response. What to you is a university?
Well, I'm so glad that Newman finally made saint. That's the best learn of the day. I think my personal definition would be similar to that. What's a school? A school, a university opens its doors to anybody who wants to learn and helps elevate them to maximize their potential. So I don't know. I'm proud that I teach at a public college. I teach anybody who comes through my doors. I see, look, certain things you teach, there are some maybe prerequisites of knowledge or capacity. So I could imagine why MIT only lets in people that have already mastered calculus. So I guess I could understand that. But a liberal arts college, I mean, what do you need? You need a capacity to read, and you need a curious mind, and that's the ideal of the university, I think. Of course, it has nothing to do with what universities in the United States actually are.
So can you speak to that a little bit more? It seems as though the university, as described by Saint Newman, have veered very far from what I take to be a very kind of inspiring and democratic ideal of what the university could be. And I came across that volume in my Harvard classics that adorn my shelf there, the Eliot classics, of course. And I was taken back by just how democratically spirited that definition is. Do you think in some ways we've strayed from that?
In some ways, I mean, in almost every regard. Are the Eliot classics, by the way, are they T.S. Eliot or are they Charles Eliot, the former Harvard president?
Charles Eliot, though T.S. Eliot is also accompanying
On your shelf?
them on the shelf. Yeah.
Well, Eliot, relatively speaking, among Harvard presidents was, in historical context, a force for good. He was succeeded by a racist, anti-Semitic, exclusionary figure named Charles Lowell, for whom one of the residential houses is named. I mean, you know, I'm joking about the question. I mean, when you say in some respects we've departed from it, I mean, in almost every respect we've departed from it. So in what senses? I mean, I could focus on elite colleges, which my book is obviously focused on, but I'll say this with respect to so many private colleges. How many of them are really open? How many of them are open to people who, principally on the basis of their desire to be educated? And how many of them really produce a meaningful diversity in a meaningful sense? I mean, we talk a lot about it in the United States a lot in terms of race.
Do you think that we've deviated from that democratically spirited definition of a university to which St. Newman gave voice so many years ago?
So, you know, we've deviated from that notion in almost every imaginable sense, right? But I was saying that, you know, deviation suggests that we had ever sort of had democratic universities in the United States, and I don't really think that's the case. So delete, I don't think so. I mean, it's not the case. I mean, Harvard and Yale and Princeton were never democratic institutions. They weren't even academically excellent institutions. So as late as the early 20th century, Harvard was just basically a finishing school for Boston Brahmins. You know, it was racist and anti-Semitic. I mean, and the professors routinely made fun of their students. Interesting, you're right, there are different notions of democracy. It was democratic in the sense that admissions to Harvard and its peers used to be based on like a single test that you would take. So anybody could theoretically get in, and so long as you could pass the test and pay the money. But the test, for example, included Latin, so you would have to have been to a high school that taught you Latin, and that really wasn't preparing people. But, you know, if you contrast it with like a college like Berea, which operates in Kentucky, which operates entirely tuition-free, and only admits socioeconomically disadvantaged students. If that's sort of an idealized concept of democracy, you know, what do we call a college where more students come from families in the top 1% of the income distribution than the bottom 60? But that's 38 colleges in the United States. So we've departed. We're radically far from that. I would say that's probably more an example of continuity than difference, but it's undeniably tragic.
Perhaps I'm wrong, and I think I'm wrong in calling it democratic, or at least in calling Cardinal Newman's or St. Newman's description of the university system as democratic. I was focusing in on his idea of taking students from every part of the country and faculty and staff from every part of the country. I think that struck a chord with me.
With me too.
Yeah,
I have no problem with your use of the word democratic. I think it captures something. I just don't think it captures what universities actually do.
Yes, absolutely. And as you responded, I came to recognize that the notion of it being democratic, not in the political sense, but universal, is certainly wrong. As you were talking, though, it also reminded me of Thomas Jefferson's sort of ideal of a university, which eventually came to be embodied in the University of Virginia at Charlottesville. Um, of course, he laid out his plans very minutely and meticulously in his notes, in his letters. He wanted very specific things, most of which he was able to get one way or another. But more than anything, he wanted the best and the brightest to attend his school, like the natural aristocracy, as he might call it, or as Aristotle might call it. Do you think that this idea of, a natural aristocracy among the young men and women of the country, coming from all parts of the nation, at that time, the young nation, to congregate at this new institute of learning, do you think that idea is just antiquated, yes, but maybe antithetical to the current American idea?
Well, it's hard to separate, right? I mean, so when we talk about what the Jeffersonian ideal is, we really have to drill down what that actually meant to Thomas Jefferson. So he didn't really mean a natural aristocracy, because obviously the smartest black kid wasn't welcome at the University of Virginia. And, the University of Virginia, though it's an aesthetically beautiful place and sure has educated many, extremely intelligent young men and women, is inequitable in the extreme. The University of Virginia actively courts legacies. So like most of the other elite colleges do sort of a hold your nose, like we know we really shouldn't be doing legacy preference, but we claim that it's essential for institutional interests. The University of Virginia actually has a legacy scholarship program. And, the University of Virginia's median income, I can check this, but I think it's on the order of, the mean is over $500,000. The median is over $200,000. So the notion that the University of Virginia is egalitarian in any meaningful sense is silly now, and was actually not even legally possible when Jefferson founded the institution. Now, do the words resonate with me? Sure. I mean, there are lots of words that Thomas Jefferson uttered that have great meaning with me, that I also understand in historical context were, the opposite of what they practiced. I mean, he didn't really think that all men were created equal.
So the flowery rhetoric, those intoxicating aromas of Jefferson, don't quite overwhelm you. They don't quite sweep you away, as they oftentimes do to me.
I'm a lot more interested in actions than words.
Yeah, I can understand that fully. So I want to ask you if the brand has in some ways lost its burnish. So in your book, of course, you focus your attention and no small part of your ire on the Ivy Plus schools, those schools, among whom we number the Princeton, the Yale, the Harvard, those traditional Ivy League schools, and some of those that are Ivy adjacent, right? So Stanford and the MIT and those sorts of institutions. But it seems to be the case increasingly that students and parents are more interested in the prestige than the education. I think that's quite indisputable at this point. I think above all, they want the brand. They want to wear Stanford the way they wear Lululemon, or they want to, demonstrate a Harvard degree. They want the way they want to reveal a Rolex watch. So my question is whether or not those brands, taken as brands, have in some ways sullied themselves. Like take Stanford as a perfect example. I mean, this was the university home to none other than Elizabeth Holmes, right? The sort of charlatan creator of Theranos, the company into which so many billions were invested and that ultimately failed. It was the home to Sam Bankman-Fried, and it's the institution at which both of his parents, I think, still currently teach in the law school. Its president, Mark, and I apologize in advance.
Levine, yeah.
Yeah, Levine is alleged to have falsified data in a scientific report from years past. And most recently, it's the site where Judge Duncan was shouted down by an unruly mob, it's difficult to call it anything but, which yielded only to the condescending pontifications of the diversity, equity, and inclusion czar. So it seems to me that's taking one example. Yale Law School has really demonstrated itself with no more decency, I would say, than its competitor, Stanford. So these reputations, I think, are sullied to a great extent. So my question to you is, have these brands in some ways lost their burnish, and do you think that will affect people's opinions and whether or not they want to send their children, and more importantly, perhaps their alumni dollars to these institutions?
Okay. I mean, I'm good. You said a lot. So, my direct answer to your question is okay, in the court of public opinion, I don't think these brands are even slightly diminished. And I think the Chetty and Friedman data shows how economically advantageous these degrees are. And, as you know, I talk in the book about how they're basically the exclusive promoter of a certain type of kind of top end mobility and access to agenda-setting elite professions like investment banking and management consulting. Supreme Court, I think basically every Supreme Court clerk has gone to one of 7 colleges. So I think that's why it's correct to focus our attention on these schools, even though Ivy League or Ivy plus, Ivy adjacent, as you said, graduates, boy, Stanford would bristle at that if they heard it. If Ivy adjacent colleges, even though they graduate a small fraction of people, they're they're disproportionately influential, and that's why equitable access matters. If I had the sense that they were trending downward, I don't think I would have written that book. But I think that this is going to be the status quo will remain for some time. You said, I'm very, very close to my heart, and I'm completely conversant / fluent in each of the episodes that you've spoken of, that you referenced. I am first and foremost, my identifications, I do this with my class. I might have put American in my top 10, 25 years ago. Not super invested in my identity as an American. I'm a father, I'm an educator, I'm a civil libertarian. So I'm 100% with you on the Judge Duncan incident. I watched a tape, the dean in saying, is the juice worth the squeeze? Well, yeah, that's what free speech is about, is, you have to listen to things with which you disagree. Well, actually, you don't have to listen. Of course, the simple answer in all of these things is, if you didn't want to go hear Judge Duncan speak, just don't go or hold a sign outside. It's astonishing that
Precisely. That
people feel they have a right to attend and shout down and be outraged if they are even slightly challenged. So I'm you've probably read it. I know you're obviously super well read, The Coddling of the American Mind. Actually, Greg Lukianoff sent me the nicest. He tweeted about my book, and we subsequently emailed, and he's like, "Oh, I was worried you wouldn't like it. Like if I liked it." I'm like, "No, it's like my favorite book of the past 10 years." So I'm totally with you about. I'm very much kind of anti the mantra of safe spaces, and I don't think college should be a safe space. College should be an intellectually challenging space. But I don't think these colleges have paid a massive price in that. But I will relate it to the subject of our conversation. I don't think they've paid a massive price for being antithetical to speech, because they've already alienated so many of the people that would be alienated by their action in this space. So, I do fault, I cast a lot of fault in their direction, but I hold them partially accountable for the mistrust of elites that exists in the United States today. And, I always say, well, I don't mistrust the New York Times. That's not to say that I agree with everything that's written or that journalists don't make mistakes. But I did go to college with like 4 people that are on the masthead. So I've at least interacted with them. So I know that by and large, they're honorable people and they have journalistic ethics. And look, if you've never met anybody who's gone on to be a professional journalist and you don't have access to going to a college that's going to prepare somebody to, write for the New York Times, why should you have any trust in the elites? But, woke liberals aren't going to care so much about, silencing Judge Duncan or the Yale law school story is equally terrible. So I don't think that's the reason they're paying a price, though I'm happy to talk further about it. I completely on the same page as you. I think it's antithetical to, a university is first and foremost a forum for free expression and thought.
Yeah, and I agree entirely with what you said. A few things on which I'd like to expand there. First and foremost, well, I want to ask you about your non-identification with America. I think that would be of interest, but maybe we can shelve that. I want to go back to that.
Let me clarify. I wouldn't
Sure.
say I don't identify myself as an American. I wouldn't list it as among my proudest identifications, whereas I would have. I'm uncertain.
You're sort of like a Diogenes, a cosmopolitan, right? A citizen of the world. If you
No,
will.
it's that's a more honorable framing than I mean it. I'm worried. I'm worried about. I used to see.
About what?
I used to see. I'm worried about the American commitment to the rule of law, so I'm not 100% sure that democracy survives.
So let's take a very controversial and recent example to America's commitment to the rule of law. Just today, or maybe it was yesterday, there was the announcement that President or former President Trump would be indicted. Now, you don't have to get into all the politics of that, but pertaining to the rule of law in that case, what are your general thoughts as a scholar in this field, as a not a resident of New York, but at least someone who works in that state?
I lived there I've lived there basically my whole life, except for the past year.
Where do you live now?
New Jersey.
Don't say it shamefacedly. You have to be proud of your New Jersey affiliation.
Do I? Well, I think, as a lawyer, the charge against Trump has the complication of he's clearly guilty of falsification of business records, which is a misdemeanor offense in New York unless committed in perpetration of in furtherance of a felony. And so they now will see when the indictment is unsealed what predicate charge they've linked it to, but I presume it's going to be some type of federal campaign violation. Not 100% sure that conviction will survive on appeal.
Yeah, and I've heard it said that the statute of limitations for this sort of misdemeanor or crime is rather narrow, and that it may have been exceeded in this case.
The statute of limitations is told for people who are outside of the state, so I think they'll survive on that. Of the other charges against Trump, the election interference in Georgia is clearly more serious, and the obstruction of justice charges are much more serious. So I wish, just from a kind of perception of the rule of law standpoint, that those charges had preceded this one, and that this was seen as sort of a tack on. And if the net of this is 2 years hence or whatever, that this is the only charge against him, that'll be unfortunate. Second thing I'll say, though, is I believe that the truth is the opposite of what Republicans have said over the past day or so. Trump is not being indicted because he's the former president. The only reason he wouldn't have been indicted is because he was the former president. It's 100% certain on falsification of business records, and that is a crime that's routinely pursued in the district attorney's office. I think that's an important fact. And then kind of the overall rule of law. I think what's tough to listen to is people say, oh, well, this is exactly what happens in third world countries. So of course Trump, campaigned in 2016 on a lock her up, which was advocacy of sort of lawless prosecution against a direct political opponent. Whatever. Alvin Bragg is not Donald Trump's political opponent in any sense of the word that I understand. And every Democrat, including, those he loathes the most, including Adam Schiff and Nancy Pelosi, have all said what anybody would say, which is that the process needs to work itself out. And so he'll be entitled to due process, and, a jury will render its decision. I was listening to CNN before.
Do you think that decision is almost foreordained, given the fact that it will be in the state of New York?
No. I mean, do I think you can get a fair jury trial? Like, do I think you can find 12 people? Yeah, sure. I mean, selecting a jury will be complicated in his case, no doubt. But there are plenty of, he's got 35% of Americans who will vote for him no matter what. That number's lower in New York. He's got some percentage of people who detest him. But, even if there's just 15% of people and smaller in New York, that's a lot of people. So they'll just go through a lot of jurors until they find people that say they can be fair and impartial. And, the evidentiary record here is going to be overwhelming. I mean, if it's fait accompli, it's only by virtue of the weight of the evidence, not by virtue of there being there's no way to fix something like this.
And assuming that there may have been I almost hesitate to say the word, but a little bit of coordination between states. This could sound a little conspiratorial, but let me just...
I'll listen, but there's no...
Yeah,
I don't even think it's possible.
I'm just thinking, do you think it was strategically inept from a purely political perspective to break the ice, so to speak, with this case? Because like you said, I agree. The cases in Georgia, right, and the obstruction cases are much stronger, I think, on the merits. This one seems quite flimsy, and I think a lot of people look at it and they think it's quite repugnant that a man who was just recently married and with a pregnant wife at home was having affairs with multiple porn stars and then paying at least one of them $130,000, right, for her silence. But they look at that and they say, okay, well, it happened, however 17 years ago, however many years ago it was, and that it's quite trivial comparatively. And they, of course, look at all the other peccadillos and worse of other politicians, of which there is no shortage, and I don't think that makes as strong an argument. So do you think that they were a little bit premature in their fire? They should have maybe held back until these stronger cases could have been brought forth? How would you, approach this if you were sort of manipulating the world?
Well, that's a different question. I mean, I think the fact that they're sequenced in the way they are is definitive proof that there is no conspiracy, because if there was some coordination, there's no way that one would have gone first. And I've never heard it. I mean, you just have to think about what the consequences would be. Suppose that Alvin Bragg had coordinated with the Georgia district attorney's name's escaping me now. I mean, how would he know in advance that she wouldn't publicize that call immediately? It's just too risky. Okay, you could say the same thing about Trump calling.
But it's an existential threat to the republic.
Yeah,
I think
some
would argue that those risks are worth the taking. No.
I wouldn't perceive, if I were either district attorney, that the republic depended on sequencing these prosecutions. It's also, prosecutors have a very strong ethical framework. And my experience are really faithful to that. Do I think, I told you which offenses I think are the most aggravated. I mean, I think the destruction of, the classified documents and the obstruction of justice and the election interference cases are significantly more aggravated than this one. But I just don't think there's any mechanism for a local district attorney to really coordinate, to sequence, things with somebody else.
And if you could forecast how this plays out, very briefly, what do you think happens?
Well, how far are we forecasting? You mean just the New York case? Or what happens if I had any idea what was going to happen in America? I mean, I would,
to autumn of 2024. No, I don't want you to to hypothesize about America's future, although perhaps the two are linked, Trump's and America's. But how do you see this case? And I don't mean to talk about this at any rate.
I'm interested in it.
Yeah.
I mean, he's going to be convicted of the misdemeanor charge. He's going to be convicted. I don't believe he will be sentenced to any jail time or any prison time for this offense. I believe he'll be indicted also in Georgia. That's a much more serious question. And I think it's 50-50 whether he's indicted by the Department of Justice. The Department of Justice has a very strong policy against against election interference, which they might interpret to apply to this situation.
So I guess my question is, does a presidential candidate, twice, perhaps thrice indicted, perhaps once convicted, does he stand a better chance of capturing the Republican primary and then winning the presidency in 2024? It's a conversation my father and I had just a few nights ago, and I think I can disclose here to you that I am no great fan of his, President Trump's. My father is a darling of a man whom I love unconditionally, but I think those who would like to see a more moral, stronger conservative candidate arise in that party, they should be somewhat anxious about the prospect of Trump, gathering these indictments and growing stronger because of them in the primary, and then advancing to the election, where he will very likely, according to all polls, early on in this stage, lose. So, your thoughts on that?
I don't think it's going to materially affect the election. I think his narrative, if he was running as a law and order, squeaky clean, by the book guy, that would, this would be really incompatible with that. In a way that, the email accusation was very damaging to Hillary, right? I mean, because she's presenting as a totally different type of candidate. So I don't think he's going to pay any significant political price for this. I just want to add, I mean, he 100% should have been impeached for the second impeachment, right? He should have been impeached the first time. I could understand.
Should have been convicted.
He should have been convicted. I could understand some people seeing that as a bit of political overreach, although I don't think it was. But the second impeachment is quintessentially, right, an abuse of power. And, even many of his core Republican supporters felt that he should have been convicted of that. That was the most aggravated thing. That was the most aggravated behavior was, a sitting president not calling for a peaceful transition of power. That's astonishing.
Yeah, and I think a lot of sober-minded Republicans did and will agree with you on that matter. I want to shift just briefly, sort of back, because I fear that we could fall into the Trumpian abyss for some time now, and I want to avoid that. But because of the freshness of that news and the relevance to our conversation, I thought it worth bringing up. But I want to go back to my point about the brand losing its burnish. You say that it really hasn't, and I grant you, I think by and large it has not. But in your book, you quote the late, and in some circles, great Antonin Scalia, no doubt a hero of yours, who said unembarrassingly before a crowd of students
you can't make a silk purse out of a sow's ear. No, you can't make a sow's ear out of a silk purse.
Out of a silk purse, precisely. that he only would select clerks from the top law schools in the country, those 7 to which you made mention. So it's a rather impolite, if not untruthful, thing to say. He was quite candid in his treatment of these students. So we fast forward to the Honorable Judge James Ho, who currently serves on the Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit. And is a conservative appointed by President Trump. And in an address to the Federalist Society, he asserted that he'll no longer be hiring clerks from Yale Law School. He mentioned Yale specifically after one of their incidents a few months ago. A school at which, in his words, cancellations and disruptions seem to occur with special frequency. Now, he encouraged his fellow jurists to do the same. Now, you talk about downward and upward mobility as it pertains to class. What about the potential descent? And I know this is similar to the question I asked earlier, but the potential descent of a once prestigious university like Yale due to the behavior of its students, faculty, and administrators. Like, do you think that judges like Judge Ho and other professionals in those industries of which you made mention, finance, and industry, and tech, do you think that they'll begin following Judge Ho's example and refusing to take on what they perceive to be, by dint of their educational affiliation, troublesome employees?
I don't think it's going to be a major trend. And I think all of the, we can look them up, but, Ted Cruz obviously went to Harvard Law School, and Josh Hawley went to Yale, I think. Went to Yale or Harvard.
I think Harvard, but you might be right.
Maybe Yale undergrad, then Harvard. Anyway, all my point is they're going to send their kids to Harvard and Yale if they can get them in. And
so I guess, and while I was reading your book, again, that I encourage everyone to purchase, I think this was one of the signals that was blaring in the back of my mind. I could follow everything that you were saying. I understand the exacerbation of inequality because of the selective processes and the legacy and other sort of nefarious and insidious techniques that they're utilizing there at these universities. But something inside me kept saying that it will change because these schools are in some ways self-destructing. Now, not to the extent that they'll, be in ruins come tomorrow, but a certain tipping point is approaching if we haven't hit it already. And I think that's maybe one point at which we diverge. Maybe in a strange way, I'm a little bit more hopeful that professionals will begin to cease hiring these students with whom they know that they're going to have a great deal of trouble based on the way in which they went about their studies and the way in which they were treated by administrators, and go to different schools with better reputations, schools that are training industrious, young, hardworking people like your students at CUNY, or maybe at a conservative college, right, of which there are now quite a few that are springing up and becoming much more selective. I think of Hillsdale College and others like it, St. Thomas Aquinas. So what do you think? Could I maybe persuade you to come over to my more optimistic side, where we see something of a diminution in the esteem that these institutions once carried?
Well, I'm not entirely pessimistic, but for a different reason than you are. These universities are all populated by people that understand and believe the core of my argument. They understand these institutions are fundamentally inequitable, and they share the political value that promotion of upward mobility is. And back to your original question, they share the idealized notion of the university. So you have this kind of weird tension that the schools don't reflect the values of their constituent faculty and administrators, right? They're all very liberal, but the schools are conservative in the traditional sense. I mean, what I'm hearing from you is you're very frustrated with kind of culture police, thought intolerance, and I'm with you on that. I'm not thinking that that's going to lead to their downfall. In terms of the rise of, I'm just looking at just as a, I'm an empiricist. It's in my top 10 self-descriptions. More and more people apply. Their endowments grow exponentially, but like acceleratingly exponentially. And I don't see any evidence, when Goldman Sachs goes to interview with Thomas Aquinas or wherever, or Hillsdale, then I'll take notice of that. But, they're not going there. They're not going to CUNY. They're just going to go to Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and Penn, and whatever, and just Wharton at Penn. And so I'm not optimistic about that. I think if there's change, it's going to have to be that as students, as there's greater diversity, because there is marginally greater socioeconomic and race diversity, that those students have to start to advocate for change. And I do think that there's going to be government, increasing government regulation. I mean, that's part of the equation. And I'll tell you something that you'll read about, and hopefully over the next whatever. So friend, colleague of mine and I, the guy, Simon Cataldo, in my book, I tell the story of a guy who founded Harlem Lacrosse. The joke is he single-handedly doubled black representation in lacrosse. Used to be 1%, and now it's 2%. So Simon's now a state representative in Massachusetts, and he's like, oh, I'd like to introduce legislation along the lines you outlined in the book. So a colleague of mine and I helped him draft a bill, which he's now introduced, and we're going to roll it out shortly, that would impose a public service fee in Massachusetts on any college that practices legacy, binding early admission, or donor preference. And it's a sliding scale based on endowment per student. In Harvard's case, it would be $102 million per year. And all of that money goes to community colleges and their students. And there's going to be increasing demands on elite colleges to diversify, let's say this. I mean, Trump imposed, the question is whether the challenge or the government regulation of elite colleges is going to come from the left or the right. So Trump imposed a 1.6% excise tax on elite colleges, but that money just went into the general fund. It would be way better to tax them and incentivize them to actually diversify their class.
Yeah, and you make a few really good points there, and one is the criticism from the left and the right. I want to get to that in a moment, but first we have to talk a little bit about lacrosse, a sport with which I must say I'm not especially familiar. It was sort of a marginal sport in high school, and I know that it's popular at a few universities. I was never really drawn to it for whatever reason, but it is nonetheless a sport upon which you empty no small portion of your scorn. I'm assuming you're not.
I have no beef with lacrosse.
On the weekends.
It's not the game. I don't care.
So tell me, I know, I'm being a little bit.
And I like golf, and I heap scoring on golf too as a college
So tell me, and our listeners, of course, what is it about lacrosse that's especially distasteful?
Well, many of them are distasteful. I thought Simon's story was very interesting to tell. So the book is always framed around stories of students or kind of do-gooders in this space. So the story of Harlem Lacrosse is really fun. He's doing Teach for America at a school in Harlem, and he's basically ready to quit. And then he has the idea of teaching his kids lacrosse, and he ends up founding a nonprofit which has helps thousands of students, and is basically the biggest promoter of opportunity for socioeconomically disadvantaged students in the country for lacrosse. Lacrosse is kind of a perfect storm of things that will really annoy somebody with my value system. I mean, first of all, it's a game that's indigenous to America, that white people co-opted in every sense. So, they anglicized the rules, and then,
they Frenchified the name.
Right? And
but isn't there something a bit warming about that? we Frenchify the name, we Anglicize the rules, we Americanize the spirit.
I don't really care about that. If 13% of the kids who played lacrosse at Johns Hopkins were indigenous, North Americans, I would feel great. If it was actually a promoter of access for Native Americans and the First Peoples of Canada, then I would love lacrosse. But in fact, it's almost exclusively played by rich white kids, and I just don't understand. I mean, to what you said. How many people are watching professional lacrosse in the United States? Nobody's tuning in on Saturday to watch lacrosse. So nobody's tuning in to watch college lacrosse, or a handful of people. So I don't understand why colleges make these massive investments of resources, and they shape society. I mean, lacrosse was very much on my mind because in the community we used to live in was, I'm not exaggerating, defined around lacrosse. Lacrosse was the sport every kid my son went to high school with. Basically, they played lacrosse almost like professionally from 10 years old on. If they played other sports, they were adjacent to lacrosse. It was a way of keeping them in shape for it. They all had coaches. They all played on club teams, and somehow European universities get by with club sports systems, right? I'm not against lacrosse. God bless. Harvard and Yale want to have club lacrosse teams. I have no problem with that. But they want to spend a few $1 million to run the program and on their coach. And that creates incentives for rich white people to move out of the city to the suburbs where they can get their kid access to a good lacrosse team. Well, now I have beef with it because now it's shaping in America in a very segregatory way.
That issue of sport appropriation is sort of a tricky one. I'm not sure exactly where I come down on it, to be completely frank, because you mentioned the fact that no one will be watching the World Lacrosse Championships tomorrow, the 1st of April, but everyone most certainly will be watching the 2 Final Four basketball games, which is a sport predominantly played and to an excellent level by Black individuals. So could you not make the same argument that Black people are appropriating a sport created I don't know the exact original founder of basketball. Spalding comes to mind. There is one man whose name is
James Naismith.
Yes. That I'll be ridiculed for not remembering that. Like I said, I'm a little bit.
Well, you're pulling something out of the. I'm not focusing on the cultural misappropriation. I don't really care that white people. I mean, whatever. I play golf, which is a Scottish-Irish sport. That doesn't make any difference to me. I don't have any problem with white people playing golf. Certainly have no problem with Black people playing basketball. That's irrelevant to me. My only investment in these are when they become pathways of access to college. So, Johns Hopkins is, you want to do something fun? Google the image of the Johns Hopkins lacrosse team. I mean, it's laughable. So these colleges are, these lacrosse teams or whatever, 20, 25 players. Well, then there's a feeder program, right? That's the varsity team. So they'll have a JV team. So you're talking, 12 spots per team, per class. Now you may say that's not very much. Well, Harvard and Yale have something on the order of 36 teams. Harvard and Yale are sort of biggish, but you go to a Division III school like, say, Williams, 1/3 of the athletes are recruited, 1/3 of the people on campus are recruited athletes. 1/3 of our admissions bucket are these sports. Okay, now what are the sports? So, basketball, relatively speaking, is egalitarian. You need to be able to afford a pair of shoes, and, everybody has a shot. People do not have a shot with lacrosse. Lacrosse, and I tell the story in the book, as recruitment has moved kind of earlier and earlier, the only way to get noticed is to play club lacrosse. And the only way you could play club lacrosse is to pay. That's a tongue twister. Many of these sports are extraordinarily expensive to play. Crew, skiing, golf, fencing. So you look at the mix. How many of these sports are sort of egalitarian and open to all? Well, basketball's pretty good. Football's pretty good. And everything else is pretty hard for people of ordinary means to pay. Tell you.
I will say you forced me to reconsider this point, and that's the job of an author and of a scholar and of a professor, because upon reading it, I'm thinking, well, let's see what happened in basketball and in football, where you have disproportionate numbers of players who are black, doing marvelously in these sports. And I think that's a great thing. It means that the best, the creme de la creme, they are rising to the top and they are performing unbelievably. And I applaud their efforts and all the success and all the money they stand to make. And I think to myself, well, could it not be that Black Americans just really aren't all that interested in lacrosse? Now, I know your argument is that there are some institutional or many institutional barriers to their entry into the sport. You spoke of many of them or all of them, but just the other day, in anticipation of this interview, of this conversation, I should say, I spoke with a few Black colleagues. Emmanuel, who played football at Colgate University, I think up in New York, and lacrosse is just not interesting to him. Now, he is an individual, that's fine, just as lacrosse isn't really interesting to me. How much do you attribute this to simple personal preference or lack of preference for a sport?
But I think you're asking the wrong question. I mean, if we were respectfully, if we were sitting here and we were at, the governing bodies of lacrosse, and I'm like, oh, we're worried about diminishing participation in the way that golf and baseball have to worry about attracting young people to the sport. Well, then this is the right question to ask. Why aren't young Black athletes playing lacrosse? Is it because they can't afford it, or is it because they don't like the game? Great question. Has no interest to me whatsoever. I mean, I'm a sports fan, so it interests me. But in this context, has no interest to me whatsoever. The relevant question is, what are we choosing to invest in as academic institutions? And when you go back to your initial question to me, which is about the definition of the university, I didn't hear good downhill skiing team as part of that. That part of the university is to bring people together who excel at a set of niche sports and making sure that we go out into the world and we're really, really good at squash. So, I mean, at least I understand if they invest in building a good orchestra. I get that.
Yeah, though that is seldom done. Yeah, and I don't think that Newman was particularly keen of downhill skiing, nor Jefferson.
But you're right. They don't recruit for the orchestra. They do exactly, but they have a great orchestra. And you know why? All that proves is just let them admit really smart, motivated people who will come with their diversity of talents. And I'm guessing many of those people will be good at sports, and just like many of those people are wonderful music performers. You don't have to organize the institution and thereby creating incentives for parents to shape their lives accordingly.
Yeah, no, and that point is well taken. And I should say that you're very clear about that in the book. But this is just my mind sort of working in different ways and trying to formulate some questions that might push a little bit in a few different directions. But no, overall, I think you're absolutely right. Now, you talk about the investments in the sports, and again, by and large, I tend to agree. The readers will be startled to learn just how few universities actually are able to turn a profit by their sports, by their television packages and their advertisements and their boosters. I mean, you turn on the television every weekend and you see these, your favorite hometown university. It's West Virginia University playing Rutgers, and you think, wow, look at the beautiful stadium and these well-paid coaches and these elegant Nike uniforms and the cheer. The whole scenery is amazing. But there are maybe only, as you said, about 25 universities that are truly profitable. Yeah, these are Texas, this is Alabama, these are the SEC schools, the Big 12, the ACC, the real heavy hitters in this space. So I do think that is one area where there is a grave misallocation of resources and of students' money and also the taxpayers' money, because I mentioned University of Florida. I'm a Florida resident now, and that's a state university, so that's something toward which my taxes go. But what about administrative bloat? That's something I noticed that was unmentioned in your work, and I'm sure purposefully, and maybe it's not exactly relevant immediately to your argument, but this is something I think with which a lot of faculty are across the nation in both private universities and public universities are dealing. At some universities, I've read that the ratio of administrators to students is 1-to-1, which is extraordinary. And a lot of the administrators' salaries, I probably shouldn't say this to you, though you may know it, are exceeding those of the staff, of those who are trained through years of study and practice, such as you as a lawyer, or such as you have as a lawyer, have undergone. So what are your opinions about this phenomenon of administrative bloat? And do you think that this is something that needs to be addressed along with legacy admissions and profligate sport programs?
Well, I mean, I think I have one sentence in the book about it, and I'm worried it may have gotten cut. But I did note that I think over the past 2 decades, the number of administrators, or the ratio as you describe it, has quintupled. So I'm trying to stay in my lane, which is, talking about elite colleges and, wealthy suburbs as drivers of inequity and segregation.
Let me give you the opportunity to deviate.
I'll answer it and say, yeah. No, but I've been at CUNY for 24 years. I've spent my whole life, both of my parents are public school educators. And what you say deeply resonates with me, and it's very troubling. I don't understand it completely, where we just went through an accreditation process at John Jay. So colleges are required to be eligible for federal funding to go through an accreditation process every 10 years. Oh my God, you would cry. So we generate, a book, 150-page document that has no relevance to any student or professor's life. The administrators may think about it, but I've sat through, oh my God, countless faculty meetings over the years, and the number of times I've heard somebody say, oh, well, we need to abide by what we agreed to in this report is close to zero. The accrediting commission sent in, oh my God, 5 people. There were half dozen administrators. I'm the chairperson of my department, so I sat there. There were half dozen administrators there, some of whom I'd never met before. Then faculty are also given release time. So there were 3 faculty members whose basically full-time job had transmogrified into working on this report. And it's like, okay, think about, say that costs $2 or $3 million to prepare in its totality. That's a massive amount of money. That's free tuition for what, 2,000 students? More.
Now, I'm not excusing the culpability of legacy admissions nor these sports programs, but do you think that a greater focus should be placed on the administration in this situation? Because that's just a sink pit of money right there. And you can only multiply that by almost orders of magnitude as you get, away from CUNY and into some of the other universities that we discussed.
So I'm unsympathetic to that argument, because in the case of, I'm really differentiating, and I try to do this in the book, I'm really differentiating the couple of dozen colleges that have endowments of greater than $2 billion from every other school. So there might be, college, 100th ranked college, which merely has an endowment of $600 million. And you might then be saying, oh, our trade-off is hiring this administrator versus letting in this additional needy kid. Okay. But I don't really think that's the trade-off that Harvard and Yale face. And in fact, as you know, I discuss in the book, and lots of people have observed, none of these colleges have increased capacity in ages. So Harvard's class is the same size as I went, and that was the same size as it was 20 years before then. And so it's really a zero-sum game whom they're going to, allow into these finite number of spots. And I don't think that's a function of money. So I just don't have them on the same continuum. I think they're independent. The administrative bloat is very lamentable. But I could imagine Harvard and Yale cutting the number of administrators, but still letting in exactly the same people that they're letting in right now.
Yeah, and I think, again, you make this quite clear in your work. It's more of a philosophical issue. Am I mistaken with you? I mean, you're looking at these legacy admissions not merely as a matter of dollars and cents. You're looking at it as a factor by which inequality is exacerbated. And I think by the questions I pose to you, I don't want that to be overlooked.
No, I'm fine with the questions are great. When you say philosophical, well, philosophically, I'm philosophically basically what you asked me in the first question, right? I believe the ideal of the university is democratic in the most extensive set of the word. It's democratic in its embracing of pluralistic ideas, right? Freedom of thought, freedom of expression, but also opens its door to the broadest range of people to find, capturing diversity in every imaginable sense. So I know if we're excluding poor people, that's really anti-democratic. What do I see legacy as? I mean, the truth is, legacy is just a rationalization. They just want to let in rich people. They just want to let in who they want to let in, and they need to come up with a rationalization for that. So legacy is a crappy rationalization, but it's better than, what the truth would be is, well, look, I have lunch with the headmaster at Groton, and I got to make sure I let in his 10 kids every year, or his job's going to be in jeopardy, and I don't want to not get my free lunch. So I'm not under any delusion that if legacy ended, that means that socioeconomic diversity would improve at these colleges, but it would make it even harder for them to justify in the court of public opinion, and I think would put some additional pressure on them to further diversify.
Yeah.
So let me say this, if they were super meritocratic, if they were like 20% of people come from the bottom quintile and 20% for people from the next to bottom quintile, and then in the top income quintile, they let in a handful of legacies so now instead of, the rich, capturing whatever you want to say, 1,200 of the 1,600 spots in Harvard's class, if now they were capturing 400, and we're going to let in a handful of legacies, that would not offend me nearly as much as what they're doing. If it's legacy rich kid versus other rich kid, that's much less offensive than legacy rich kid versus poor kid, which is what it is today.
You mentioned just in passing a word on which I want to expand a little bit, and that is meritocratic. Now, in America, I think since our founding, there's been a tension, and I think Tocqueville described this most eloquently in his works during his travels here, during the Jackson administration. And that is the tension between the meritocracy, which of course is a word whose coining comes to us only recently, within the past few decades or so, and that more egalitarian spirit, that more equal spirit. So a professor of yours, of whom I'm also quite fond, Michael Sandel, to whom you make reference in your book, has been especially vocal about the tyranny of meritocracy, I think, or the tyranny of merit, I think, as he entitled his last book, which was very widely read and well received. He makes good arguments in that book and in subsequent lectures that I've seen, but still something of that tension exists in me, that tension of the meritocratic and the egalitarian, and the democratic, let's say. In some ways, I think that meritocratic is just a newfangled term for aristocratic, which of course has connotations of wealth and birth, and the inheritance of sort of undeserved features. Whereas truly, as I mentioned earlier, in the Aristotelian or Jeffersonian sense, this aristocracy, this aristoi, was supposed to include the best. And now, of course, it excluded, in Aristotle's time, maybe many slaves, and Greek slaves, and in Jefferson's time, many black slaves. But what are your opinions on meritocracy? Do you think that it's a useful term in this day and age? Do you think that it should continue in our just daily parlance, in our ways in which we look at people who are either deserving or undeserving, and whatnot? What are your thoughts about that?
Well, first thing, just saying back to Tocqueville, right, is that everything is sort of needs to be understood in context. So America was egalitarian as compared to France, but not really egalitarian in any sense of the word that we would understand. And meritocratic, again, you get into semantic issues. So, I grade students all the time, and I do give A's, and I give B's and C's and D's, and I have some sense of giving students, I might say, oh, well, I tried to give you the grade that I thought you deserved. Okay. However, it's the breadth with which merit is defined in the United States that's really problematic. So first of all, the sense, what question might you ask? What merit-related question might you ask in college admissions? So first of all, when we talk about merit or desert, I think normally we're talking about moral worthiness or hard work. Well, colleges certainly don't attempt to admit the hardest working students or the most morally virtuous students.
Which admittedly could be difficult to measure and to gauge.
Of course, I'm just saying nobody makes any pretense about that. And then, I think what they would say is, well, we're trying to let in the people that are best prepared to succeed in college, but it's not what they do either, because if they really were going to do that, they wouldn't focus so much on the SAT. The SAT is a very poor predictor of college performance. High school GPA is a much, much better, very strong predictor of college performance. And, all of these elite colleges could achieve significant gains in diversity if all they did was take the valedictorian of every high school class in the United States and conduct a lottery among them, because then you'd be picking up the diversity, you'd be picking up all kinds of diversity through geographical diversity. So they don't do that. So I think what I resent the most is constructing a system that doesn't operate on the basis of merit in any sense that we understand, while simultaneously telling students that they are the most deserving of their class there. So if, I always say this, look, if Harvard and Yale and Princeton said, look, we're not corporations exactly, we're not profit maximizers exactly, but we're status aggrandizers, and we're in a race with one another to get to $1 trillion endowment first. And then they said that at freshman convocation and said to their students, look, let's be honest here. You're not the best and brightest of the United States. You're, some of the best and brightest, mostly of the rich and the richest. And we've admitted a set of you that serve our institutional interests, which include the people that we think are going to best make a fundraising donor base and give us good lacrosse and squash teams. So be humble, everybody. But I never hear be humble.
With what word might you replace the meritocracy?
Well, are you asking me that as a prescriptive or a descriptive matter? Are you asking me what I think it is that we actually do, or
Descriptive.
what we should do?
Descriptive.
What we actually do is universities let in the students that most serve their institutional interests. They're not letting in the most deserving students. They're using people to further their institutional goals. What should they do? Well, I'll keep going back to your initial question. What does a democratic admissions process look like? Well, I'd let people in based on some demonstrated openness to knowledge and capacity to grow.
Yeah. Again, you're sounding more like the idealist, less like the practical man that you declared yourself to be.
What did I declare myself to be? I'm an idealist.
I think you should knock empiricism to the 11th spot or the 12th spot on your top 10 list of self-identifications.
I don't know what
because that's sort of that poetic ideal with which I resonate.
Oh, well,
but of course, I'm not an academic.
I'm a downright romantic about college. I mean, even when I went to high school with my dad, I was thrilled, and I'm an atheist, but hand to God, still, I still am thrilled every time I walk into a classroom. I revered Harvard. I considered myself very lucky to be there. It was such a beautiful place, and I presume you feel this in the book. If I didn't think that these institutions were worthy and capable of doing great things and being democratic, I wouldn't write it. I mean, I didn't write this book, wishing that that British Petroleum, would start becoming more democratic. There's no there, but these institutions have an enormous capacity to do good.
Yeah, and I should say that you certainly make that obvious. The heartfelt regard that you have for learning, for education, for these higher institutions of education is very warmly described and sincerely felt by a reader such as myself. Whether it be the relationship that you had with your father as he ascended in the public school setting to the level of a principal, or your own dedication to the same profession in a different way. So far, I think I've counted maybe 4 or 5 of your top 10 identifications. We have atheist, cosmopolitan, empiricist,
I don't know if atheist is top
golfer,
10.
golfer,
not top 10.
and lover of lacrosse. Are there any more? And
yes, lover of lacrosse is way up there.
And I should add to that that impressive list, writer of fiction. So I want to make a left turn, and I want you to tell us a little bit more about your career as a fiction writer. So you've written on themes as diverse as time travelers, aliens, and as I mentioned earlier in my prefatory remarks, that Gwen Stefani and the obsessed mathematical geniuses of whose amours she was the inspiration. So tell me a little bit about the mental agility needed to go from a work like Poison Ivy to a 200-page work that's critical, analytical, empirical, and really sharp-tongued to these works of fiction for which or with which you've had some success.
Sorry, my dog started barking. Well, Dreaming of Funny is really, it's kind of a meditation on free will. My novels were all kind of funny and Vonnegut-y, if you like. If you're a Kurt Vonnegut fan, he was one of my heroes. It's an interesting question. In real time, there's no great agility required because I'm not writing a novel and a nonfiction book at the same time. And I'm sitting right now. I moved since we started chatting, but this is basically where I wrote most of Poison Ivy, staring into my kitchen. And it takes a lot of discipline, and it takes a long time. So I sat at this chair 7 days a week for, I don't know, 2.5 years, minimally 3 hours a day, sometimes 8 or 9 or 10. So like I'm completely immersed in that when I'm doing it. And then I go on to the next thing. And so when I'm working on a novel, I'm just completely immersed in the novel.
Let me interrupt really quickly. Do you have certain techniques that enhance your focus? I don't mean to say illicit substances, nothing like that, but I always find it interesting.
I wouldn't be offended.
And I don't think you'd be hesitant to disclose those, but no, that's not my intention. I mean to say, do you have a certain writer's technique? Like you said, okay, I sit down for 2 hours. And of course, you are a rather prodigious writer. I mean, you have, like I said, 8 books to your name in total. But do you work in a certain way? Do you begin with pen on paper? Are you pacing your room, talking into your recorder? Or are you just one of those people who can open up his Word document and right off the bat start getting down ideas and gaining that momentum in writing? Just tell us a little bit about that process for you personally.
Well, I know you do some mindfulness stuff, so I'm definitely, I mean, I have my own version of that. I'm a runner and a hiker, so I'll be outside. And I was joking with my therapist one time, and I was like, well, I really only have time. I could meditate a half hour a day, or I could run a half hour a day. And he's like, I think you should run. But it's very meditative for me, right? And I think that's very, very important. And I think sleep is very important. And I'm amazed at how much hard work of thinking just happens when you're asleep. And I just wake up and I just have a problem that's solved. I'm definitely a morning person. I'm very structured. So we're talking in the afternoon, and I wouldn't have scheduled this for the morning. I'm working on a piece about affirmative action right now. And I'm completely immersed in it. I mean, what I'm lucky about, well, I don't know if this is lucky, but to the extent I have a sort of work philosophy, it's to do what you love. So I loved writing Poison Ivy. I'm sure you can feel my connection to my students, whose story that I love telling. You can feel, I'm sure, the passion I have for the issue, the love I have for CUNY, the frustration and love I have for Harvard. And so that makes it very easy. I mean, I'll sit with an idea for a while, and then I'll be like, okay, I really want to say something about that. And all of my novels have a core idea. One, I used to have my books behind me, but the premise of one where you mentioned aliens is that it was when Bush was president. I had the idea that aliens contacted Earth, and the president was an idiot and screws everything up. So in the book, the president, on very flimsy evidence, becomes convinced that the aliens are Jewish, and this sends things down a kind of burn path. And of course,
didn't Marjorie Taylor Greene proclaim something similar?
Yeah, I was going to say, you're in retrospect, he seems super savvy. All of this, it's very, very hard to create fiction that would be stranger than what we're living through now. I did TV writing too. I've written a bunch. I worked on a show that actually did reasonably well, and then I'm always pretty happy. Like, for me, most of I wouldn't say I'm overall like a super happy, optimistic guy, but a lot of my stress is just I just like being able to express myself. And I would just like to be able to do the next thing. Like it's very hard when you're writing that you just spend a lot of time pitching. And it's funny, you said that I'm successful, and I don't see it that way. But and this is, I mean, I did get 4 novels published, and Q was, if you look, Q has been optioned to be a movie several times, and it was published in some other languages, right? This all sounds amazing, but probably cumulatively, I don't even want to think about this, I've probably made a total of between $250,000 and $300,000 writing. And I've written, I've probably worked almost 7 days a week for, I would say, 33 years.
Yeah.
So I worked it out once to about $2 an hour. So I just try to only do things that I would do for free. I would teach for free. I would write for free. I'm happy to chat with you. I don't want any money for that. And I think so long as yeah, right. Yeah, I'm coming.
Don't check your Venmo account. There's nothing forthcoming.
I think that's the secret. I think if you, and you know, that's a luxury. That is a privilege though, too, is I'm lucky enough that I can do it. When I was a lawyer, I didn't feel like I was doing what I loved. So if you're, if you're present and you really love what you're doing, it's pretty easily. But I've never had any writer's block. But I do talk to myself a lot. I don't dictate, but it's very, I don't know if my writing style resonated with you, but for me, it's very rhythmic and musical. And I am very, very invested in the quality of my sentences.
Yes. And again, I can attest to that being evident through every line. It's clear to me that you have a very finely tuned writing process. And once I realized that, you were the author of multiple books, to which with which I'll be spending some time once we finish this conversation, maybe starting with Gwen Stefani, it became even clearer to me. And I do the same thing, not as it regards to writing, but running. Like, I love to be outside. And there is something very mindful about that. I don't want you to think just because you're exercising, you're not also being incredibly mindful and having those that meditative half hour or meditative hour, whatever it may be, out there in the universe, because it is extraordinarily potent. And once you have that, you spoke of that rhythmicity. You have that rhythmic breathing, certain pulse that is just right when your heartbeat is at whatever it may be, 120 or whatever you measure it. You empiricist, I don't measure it. And you're in that favorite spot of the neighborhood where it's just a little uphill, and there's a little chill in the air, and it's just enough to invigorate your lungs. There's just nothing like that. And I find whenever I'm embarking on any creative endeavor, it's usually like a few miles into that run, or as soon as that run is completed, that little, I don't know, match is kindled. And that's really when the work starts coming, and the creative.
It's a reverie. I mean, when it goes well, I mean, I've had moments where I've just written entire books in my brain in 5 minutes. It's just a flash of insight. And, everything you said resonates with me. It's just a flow state. And people get so many things wrong about this. Even just walking can be very meditative. But if you put earphones over your head and you're closed off to nature, and you're not observing the world, then I don't think your mind can achieve whatever types of brain waves are producing that comfort. So,
have you always had this mental, connection with what you're doing physically and with the artistic output that then is produced by it? Or do you think, or not do you think, or was this something that you deliberately put into practice? Did you have an experience, or did you read a book? Was it Eckhart Tolle, or was it Deepak Chopra? Did you experience somebody who kind of led you to this, or did you kind of stumble upon it?
I intuited it. I have to say, you're the only person ever to take me down this line of question. I'm nobody will care what we think about it, but I'm interested to talk about it. I did read Eckhart Tolle much later on, and for me, the stuff that I've read is just confirming things that I've always believed about the world. And so, I read, I don't know what Buddhism I read at some point, but I was like, oh, well, that's what I believe in. I don't know what a Buddhist says. It's like right thought, right? So I try to see the world accurately. I'll do that. It doesn't even matter. I could be having a fight with somebody whom I vehemently disagree, but if they make a fair point, I'll be like, oh, that's a fair point. Oh no, well, like you said, coordination. No, I don't see it that way, right? But you're responsive to that because you clearly are a practitioner of that. I've always had the same value system. I've never placed value on money. I've always done some version of meditation, explicit meditation or exercise as meditation, depending on how my life was structured. I'm presuming you don't have children?
I do not.
Yeah. Well, when you have kids, you see when you're going to squeeze in, that whole equation changes. And so I was like, well, I don't want to be fat and I like running and like, you're making choices, but what you said, I've always compartmentalized, segmented tasks. So one of my mantras has always been, like I was a marathon runner. I'm like, you don't run 26 miles. You just run to the next telephone pole 500 times. And it's the same with writing. I can't write 350 pages. I can write, 500 words in a day. And I just do that a lot. So I know that's now a kind of thought practice. And I think there are a lot of major distractions. Marx might talk about as mystifying influences, but I mean, there are things that people care about. They literally have no interest in me. I don't care about cars. I don't care about clothes. I mean, I think I dress more or less like you're dressed neater than I am right now. I would wear that level shirt. I like to look neat. And just people fall off track. I've certainly tried to instill the same values in my kids. I value humor greatly.
Yeah, no doubt, or else you wouldn't suffer me very well or very long.
Oh.
Again, I think it seems to me that you just sort of have this intuitive, I don't know, sort of cosmic awareness of the now, which is unusual. Is that the case? Like, do you have any? I don't think you mentioned siblings, but do you have any other relatives who are similar to you in this way, and maybe from
none
whom you
whatsoever.
This technique?
None whatsoever. I will say, to my amazement, my father revealed to me, I mean, when I was 45 years old, that he had done transcendental meditation his whole life. And I'm like, well, I don't understand. When did you do that? And I guess he must have gotten up before me and he does it. But no, my parents, my father is a very ethical man. Not to say that my mother's not, but my father is like sort of practicingly decent. But they never understood. Like I first time I went hiking, I was like, I love this. This is now my favorite thing. Right. And honestly, my dream trip would be to be like airdropped in the middle of Alaska and I have to get my way out. Right. And nobody else in my family really sees it that way. When I left being a lawyer to go teach, I was like, I want to teach and write. I remember my grandmother, what she said to me, you're out of your mind. I think she may have said, you're a fucking moron. No,
that sounds more like grandma.
And, I just hit a big threshold. I now, 24 years after I started, make half as much as I made when I left being a lawyer. But I don't understand. I actually don't, you say this to me. I mean, you're nodding your head and giving me warm body language, but most people would think I was out of my mind.
No, not at all. I think you're.
Well, you don't.
I think you're extraordinarily brave and daring and inspirational in a lot of ways, because I see myself, and I won't delve too much into my story right now, but at a similar juncture where you're looking for a fulfillment of that purpose, right? So you felt as though there was some sort of calling. Now, I know you're professedly an atheist, but it seems to me to be the case that you felt as though there was a sense that you weren't quite fulfilling your telos, your end, the purpose for which you were created or born or brought into this world. And I think indubitably you now are. Let me ask you, though, a little bit about that fact that you're not quite a Buddhist, at least not in the proper traditional sense. You're a declared atheist. In these moments of transcendence or nowness, as Tolle might say, with a capital N always. Do you ever begin to flirt with the notions of a superintending force, deity, God, what have you? What do you think?
I haven't. I wish I did. I would find it comforting. I do. You may define this. I don't know how to define this. I do sense some sort of deep, I think of it as deep music in the universe. There's a rhythm to things. I feel like, and I can see you have the same sense of humor that I do, that there's an absurdity to things that I think is deeply funny, and that's a very core human thing. I mean, I could literally laugh at anything. We went to see Sarah Silverman the other night. You know she is, yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So her first joke, she opens with, "I'm going to tell you an old-fashioned joke. Is what did the Jewish mother say to her daughter after seeing her in a video of a gangbang? You were the best one." All right, so that's just an extraordinary joke. Okay. The opening act was a Black woman. She was magnificent. And she told a joke, and she was like, "Oh, I found out I was mispronouncing somebody, and I felt very bad because I want to call them what they want to be called. And so they weren't a he, they were they, and I'm really happy to do that. I'm just saying, though, it makes me sound like I'm an escaped slave." And then she says, "They coming." It's a great joke.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm walking down the stairs, and these people behind me are talking about how she came right up to the line. And I'm like, so you paid money to go to see Sarah Silverman, okay, when the title of the tour is itself a reference to her female genitalia.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And I'm like, you're sitting there scrutinizing whether or not we've come up to, now you think that's funny, and I think that's funny, and they're sitting there judging funny. So I feel something, but I don't know what to call it. And I wish I'm open.
There might be some mystic inheritance in both the Black and Jewish populations, and I was raised Jewish, and sort of flirting with a return to that religion. I've been something of an apostate for the past few years, but on my own sort of weird spiritual numinous journey. But to the point, there's this humor that is, I think, the child of suffering, like a long ethnic history of suffering. And I think Blacks, and I think Jews especially, are possessed by that spirit. So yeah, that's just a great combination to have Sarah Silverman and to have that other young lady perform back to back. I'm sure was just great.
You need to belong to the Church of Vocabulary, because the number of people that use words that I don't know, it's very rare, but you've used a few.
Is that a church to which I could recruit you? I think that we can check off atheism from the list, and we will.
Can I tell you what?
We will baptize you into the Church of Vocabulary.
You'll like this, since we're on religion. I've written some short stories too, so I just put them out myself. Okay.
Let me ask you really quickly. Where can these be found? Of course,
everything's on Amazon.
Okay, because I'll add links, of course, to all these great works in the show notes, and I'll encourage everyone.
It's not the point of the story. You're going to get a big laugh in a second. So one of the stories is sort of, I used to do stand-up, and the story is kind of a version of a routine I used to do, which is, well, why if the elders of Zion existed and Jews controlled like all of the banks and the governments, why have Jews had such a shitty lot throughout history? And it turns out like the elders of Zion are like this really inept organization of old like Borscht Belt comedians. So the title of the short story collection is The Revised Protocols of the Elders of Zion, Stories of Neurotic Obsession. And if you look on my Amazon page, and I published this as widely as I could, there's a review. It says 1 star, nothing to do with the actual elders of Zion.
Of course.
I love that so much.
Yeah. That about sums it up, doesn't it?
That's life.
Have you ever backslid into comedy? I mean, it's again, your story is just so utterly fascinating, and I love talking with people like yourself who have been so nimble, through their lives, and will continue to be so, dancing between all these different careers and these thoughts and these ways of being. So do you have a plan in the future to get back onto the stage, the improv stage, and perform there, either in New York or in New Jersey? It's an easier crowd in New Jersey. You should start there.
Well, I don't know what middle-aged Jewish man stand-up comedy looks like. It's like,
That's every comedian I've ever seen.
now I have to wear reading glasses when I type in,
that's Seinfeld. That's Louis C.K. That's Louis Black. I mean, the list is endless.
I think the book is funny. I bet you laughed a few times when you read it.
Is that your wife in the background saying, no, it's not?
No, my daughter's best friend. I'm pretty, my class is a bit stand-up-y, so.
Yeah. So that's interesting. You are able to bring out that stand-up spirit in the classroom before an audience, and maybe in the courtroom as well. Maybe you were inhabiting that role in a certain way. But yeah, certainly in your even in your more serious work, there is that. It's a more sardonic, biting, humor, but it's there. It's palpable.
I do it 100%. I do it all the time. I heard Bill Maher, and I have to say this is true. Bill Maher was being interviewed, CNN's new format, Anderson Cooper. Oh, no, he's being interviewed on CNN. It's Jake Tapper. And Bill Maher says, I could be canceled in a minute. And of course it's true. So like one day in class, I mean, there's one kid who's literally the victim in every hypothetical I come up with. I mean, he dies in the most extreme ways. This one, amazing Black girl, but she talks very rarely, and she started to say something, but the biggest talker in the class is this white woman, and she says something, and I go, no, let the white woman finish first. But there's a trust. I think they all know where I'm coming from, and I make very significant investments in my students' lives. I mean, I feel like if somebody really wants to learn, I will literally do anything in my power to advance their lives.
Yeah, and I hope that's deeply felt, because as a professor, I would be anxious, wouldn't even begin to describe the feeling about the possibility of being canceled or brought up before a board of administrators, right, to whom you have to argue your case. So do you feel that anxiety a little bit? It sounds as though you don't. You build that trust with your student body. And again,
Sorry. Dan, finish.
No, I was just going to say at the City University, as you describe in your book, you're working and you're teaching to a different population, right? So whereas that joke might land you in the prison, the academic prison at Harvard, maybe it's more acceptable at your university. So do you feel at times that pressure that you are ever walking on eggshells, and how will you respond if ever that does happen? Because someone like you, who has this sardonic wit and this sort of this inherent irony about life, that needs to be vented, that needs to express itself somehow, because again, we sort of share that, and if you just keep that stifled for too long, you're just not the same person.
So I think every teacher feels afraid of that. Probably every teacher at every level right now. And actually, what I would most like to write my next book on is cancel culture. Although the guy I mentioned, Greg Lukianoff, who did The Coddling of the American Mind, his new book is The Canceling of the American Mind. So he may have beaten me to it. I mean, I have tenure and I'm doing it a long time, and I have a long track record, I think, of helping students. And I think most of the people get me. So I'm not skating on super thin ice. I think I've built up a foundation, but it's still terrifying. And I had my moment. It's definitely a cautionary, whatever, tale. During the pandemic, so before the pandemic, I had a student in my class who wore a MAGA hat. And I didn't love the MAGA hat, but I thought about it for myself. And I was like, is there any limit? I was like, would I teach a kid who wore a swastika hat into class, right? I was like, I think I would, right? But I wouldn't. It's not my first choice. And so actually, he's a very, very smart guy. Got a 165 on the LSAT. He's got a full scholarship. I think he's going to end up going to St. John's Law School. And so I talked to him and I was like, hey, what do you want to be? You want to be a redneck conservative, or you want to be perceived as a William F. Buckley conservative? So he takes off the hat. Okay. Fast forward, he's at the honors program has a colloquium. It's online. I'm not present for this event. And he says, I don't get the context. He says, why should I care about Breonna Taylor? And there's pandemonium. 3 weeks later, a student invites me to speak at a forum on freedom of speech. Okay. And I don't usually draft my remarks, but I did this time. So we're there for 2 hours. And I talk about, it's like, democracy's hanging on by a thread. What does democracy mean? Why aren't we worried that the military would side with Trump in a coup? It's because they've had the benefit of, an education at the academy. What's the foundational value of the academy? And I build up to, look, I know a lot of you were annoyed by what the student said about Breonna Taylor, but, of course, first of all, literally, he asked a question, right? He didn't even really say anything. And so I was like, tell him why he should care about Breonna Taylor, or tell him he's a racist and explain why. He's a big boy. If he's going to say something like that, he has to do it. But I go, we can't cast someone out of the community for saying something that, we disagree with. And then, so one of the students recorded 47 seconds of the 2 hours, and I didn't even say anything. I didn't even say anything on this clip.
You don't need to.
They kept saying that I had organized the event, and I hadn't organized the event. So they repeated this 7 times, and I smiled because I thought it was funny because it wasn't true. And they sent that to the president and said I was a racist and should be fired. And, what I find terrifying about this is, to me, it wasn't, it was a student of color who complained about me. And actually, though I disagreed with the claim, I was happy in a way that a student felt empowered enough to say something. But when I got into lawyer land, and I'm an attorney, so I'm interacting with our Title IX officer, and I was like, well, okay, this is my career. What policy am I alleged to have violated? And she sent me 2 policies, and I'm like, well, I didn't sexually harass the student, and I didn't even take any action. I couldn't have discriminated against her. There's no action here, right? I didn't give her a grade. I didn't even say anything. And then you get into, well, they just feel, it's
there you go.
Felt, right? And
that's
then,
all you need. That's all you need to do is feel a certain way.
Exactly. And then the director of the honors program, my wife's not white. I'm not going to say that to the student. I'm not going to. It's just too.
That's no immunity to what's coming. That won't immunize you.
But I'm not going to. Even if it would have, I wouldn't say it because I just think it's just intellectually diminishing. I mean, right? And but I said
you're right. It is intellectually diminishing, but I do think it's exculpatory. I'm not
getting off that way.
I
agree. And but I did say to my colleague who runs the honors program, I was like, well, I would think there would be certain things that would just make it obvious that I wasn't coming from a hateful place on this. Did you say any of these things? And he says, well, no, as part of the historical power establishment, meaning as a white male, I have to validate ... And I was like, yeah, this is intellectually moribund. So it's terrifying, but, I'm not going to let the thought police on either side dictate what I say or think.
That's so refreshing to hear you say that. And I'm sorry that you had to suffer that experience, although I'm sure it's not exceptional. I'm sure that it is somewhat common, unfortunately.
I wish that apology came from somebody who actually did something, as opposed to somebody who's obviously interested in books and ideas and conversation with people, regardless whether they agree or disagree.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think you approached it an absolutely tactful and professorial way. I mean, you laid out.
I did not. I want you to say that. But months later, they said to me, well, I guess what was happened was the student was sort of had second thoughts about it. And they're like, do you want to have a meeting? And I was like, well, here's what I'll say. I believe absolutely in freedom of speech, and I continue to feel that way. Do you think it would be good for me? And I had no regrets whatsoever about what I said. Do you think it would be helpful to the situation if I restated that? And they were like, yeah, maybe not. So I wasn't all that tactful.
Yeah. But in the student's defense, and I don't know him from Adam, but like you said, he simply did raise the question. Now, it sounds to me as though he's sort of a deliberate controversialist, right? He's wearing the
initial guy. Yes, he's a provocateur, 100%.
Yeah. Which, so long as it's innocuous, I mean, he's not causing physical harm in the original sense of the word. Those provocations are welcome, I think. And again, and I'm not in the academic setting right now. I've been in it previously, but I was always stimulated, and usually it would be the professor being the provocateur in a very controlled way, bringing up an idea that may not have been considered previously, and that's what you should get from a good book like yours. I read it and I'm provoked by certain things, and when I thought whatever it may be about the elite institutions, and you're talking about these these systemic problems, I'm like, like how can I, using my knowledge, my limited knowledge about the university system, like how can I try to prod around the edges of that argument and see if I can get something out of that. But that's in a more, I guess, amiable way. We're talking about provocateurs, and I think the provocative need to be protected. They need our protection because a provocateur is like a Sarah Silverman, whom
you said so many things that are correct. I mean, the correct role of the professor in that situation would be to direct the students to answer that question. Okay, he's challenged you. Why should he care?
Right, and you might.
It's an honest question. He didn't use a racial epithet.
Heretofore, unquestioningly, you may have accepted the fact that Breonna Taylor 100%. Matters.
I articulated an answer.
As an empiricist such as yourself, these need to be examined. They need to be scrutinized, and I think you are employing the Socratic method in its best form. You're raising a question. Okay, what is virtue? Or why does this matter? Why does the death of a young woman matter? Well, it matters for many reasons, just as virtue matters for many reasons. But you need to explore them. You can't just nod your head and say it matters, and then shout down anyone who says, no, it doesn't matter. No, you need to be able to articulate your reasons.
But so important also, I mean, like, that young people or all people understand that you won't be damaged by having that conversation, that maybe we disagree, and that's okay. Maybe he's just a racist, and you know what? You'll still be okay. You'll be like, that dude's a racist. I don't want to be his friend, and that's fine, right? It's this idea that it's traumatizing to hear somebody question something which seems obvious to you. I mean, I'm not traumatized by people believing in QAnon. I have to say, if I did my own podcast, all I would do is interview people with whom I had the biggest disagreement. I just think it would be fascinating.
Why don't you? I know you have commitments and you have a family, that whole thing.
We can talk about that.
I would absolutely tune into to a show hosted by a former stand-up comedian, fiction writer, lawyer, professor, runner, hiker, atheist.
Well, anyway, but the point is, I wouldn't be damaged by the conversation. I mean, you know, would I interview Hitler? Of course I would. I'm not going to vote for Hitler. I might kill him at the end of the interview, but I'd be fascinated.
Some good views on YouTube. You'll definitely rack up a little ad revenue that way to supplement your 200,000 from your book sales. but no, and I feel
that was a total number. Remember,
I feel
lifetime.
But I feel precisely the same way, and I can't quite understand why everyone doesn't. It seems so natural to me. Maybe it comes from just an inherent curiosity about the world and about other people who inhabit this world.
Yes.
Maybe it's a deepened sympathy with humankind, right? And I feel some sort of connection that maybe others don't or haven't yet experienced. I think also, though, it's attributable to our shared mindfulness. And I know that's an ambiguous term and it captures a lot of things, but it's this sense that, you know, you are not your opinions. You might have principles upon which your life is structured, but thoughts come and go. They are fleeting. They are fugacious.
That's an interesting framing.
Right. So that's the way I've started to look at things, and maybe I always have, but I'm doing so more deliberately now, as though, you know, a proposition might be raised, and I'll say this: I think very highly of your work. I'm a little bit more conservative leaning. So be it. I can easily be persuaded that, you know, the arguments put forth by someone on the left are stronger than those put forward on the right. And I understand that certainly there are values that precipitated and inspired my opinion, but all it is an opinion. I can have an opinion on anything, and it's mutable. It can change at any moment. And that mindfulness and that ability to meditate on that fact, to sort of hover above yourself and observe the brain functioning in that way, I think is most useful in dealing with these interactions as you describe them. So maybe that needs to be instilled, if it can be instilled in the rising generation, because you're experiencing as a professor probably the beginning of what's going to be a difficult wave of generational, I don't know, a generational zeitgeist where harm becomes increasingly broadened, that the definition becomes increasingly broadened, and an inability to interact and exchange thoughtful ideas and opinions is more and more common.
I'm interested in the connection you made. So post 2016 election, I read a lot. I was like, what's going on here? And I wanted to teach my ethics class, which I model on Sandel's class that I took in college, which I really enjoyed. I wanted to take it to the most right-leaning place I could find. And my hypothesis was it would be exactly like the class that I've taught everywhere else. You
mean to say you took your reading to the furthest reaches of the right?
No, I wanted to take my class that I wanted to go teach.
I see.
I had a sabbatical.
I see.
And so I ended up teaching the class at, they say, Appalachian State University. It's in Boone, North Carolina. The truth is, it's not as right-leaning as I would have liked. Very sadly, the poorest, most right-leaning rural counties had almost no ethics classes at their local universities. So that was sad. But anyway, I taught the class at Boone, and it was exactly the same as anywhere else. And a student got pissed off. There was a conservative guy in the class. He was a libertarian. Loved this guy. I love this guy. You know, I don't just, you know, what do I even care if you really disagree with me about it? You said you're a little bit more conservative. Well, so long as, you know, you don't believe that a leader gets to fabricate a fiction about an election and that we're going to proceed on that, I don't really care. I mean, climate change, I would care.
Well, to me, that's not conservatism.
It's just insanity, right?
It's antithetical to the idea. And I think that's another problem, the separation of the cult of personality from constitutionalism or conservatism. I mean, I mentioned Tocqueville. He's sort of my political idol. You know, people like that. Burke, people that I esteem very highly from the old times.
You're very well read. But So in the course, I wrote this article. You'll like it. It's in Politico. It's called "What Teaching Ethics in Appalachia Taught Me About America."
Hmm.
It's a bit about. It's a lot about civil libertarianism. It's a bit about, but it's really about careful listening. So I interviewed. She'll be before your time, but a feminist psychologist, sociologist named Carol Gilligan. But she practices, and I always tell you, I like things that describe things I'm already doing. She calls it radical listening, and that's what I do. I mean, I'm talking way more than I normally would because it's your pod. I'm on your podcast. But I would just sit and listen. It doesn't, I'd be interested. You mentioned your father, your relationship with your father. I'd be interested to hear about that. I'd be interested to hear about podcasting. If you have conservative views, I'd listen. It doesn't bother me at all. I teach about the death penalty. You want to tell me why you think people should get killed? It won't bother me. I might even laugh. I mean, it's not unlikely to change my mind. That's okay. But it's deep presence, because I feel like what most people are doing is they're listening because they're ready to perform, right? They want to make their argument. They want to posture themselves in a certain way. That's antithetical to listening. And it's hard. I mean, like, whatever. I want to be cogent for you, so I have to script a little bit. So I'm listening 10% less than I normally would. But I think you're right. It's very deeply connected to mindfulness. There are external stimuli, and that's what's out there.
Yeah, and you need to build that mental fortitude to be able to recognize that the fact that yes, there is an external world and your own interior. And I should say that's why, even though it's a modest little program, I love doing this, because all I want to do is radically listen. Of course, you might disagree because I have these sort of long-winded questions and prompts, but it's just really the conversations that are going on in my mind. These are monologues, and what I want to do is put them out into the ether, into the world, and hear what brilliant people like yourself have to say. And I could just sit back and, again, listen to what you have to say, listen to the silences, the way in which you present yourself, the way in which you express yourself, your body language. My only wish is that we could do it, and I could do this with all people in person, and that would be great, because there's so much that's lost in this form of communication in this medium.
Well, podcasts are very nice. I like podcasts. I think it's a very intimate. There's an intimacy to it that I really enjoy, and same. I don't think I'm that brilliant, but I can listen. I think if you're a really good listener, and you kind of have you just follow the question, you kind of ask the right questions, you can, everybody has a fascinating story.
I absolutely agree, and I know I may have misused the word democratic earlier in describing John Henry Newman's approach to education, but I don't think I'm wrong in describing podcasting as democratic. Now, the joke is that everybody and his brother has a podcast, and most of them are unlistened to and sort of unimpressive. And mine might fit into that category as well. But the thing I love about it is, and the YouTube platforms, is that pretty much anyone can do this. My setup is now it's a little bit better. I have a camera at which I'm looking, but usually it's just a laptop computer with a webcam that functions occasionally, a microphone next to me that can be purchased very cheaply, plugged into the laptop as a USB. You purchase the little what do they call it? An RSS feed. It might cost you $10 a month or so, and suddenly you're Dan Rathers. Suddenly you're David Letterman. You're this person who can potentially broadcast out to thousands or millions or tens of people in this intimate fashion. And I see that as being incredibly democratic. Now, does that mean that institutions will fall and that all the inbuilt problems in our country will suddenly dissolve? No, of course not. But I am hopeful that this form of very democratic and accessible communication will be in part the remedy that I think we need, and maybe some of your younger students need, to be able to to weigh different ideas and maybe even take the opportunity to create their own content and to express themselves. Because like I said earlier, so often we're in our own minds. I'm developing these questions, these prompts. Okay, what do I want to ask Professor Mandery or Evan? And you just get wrapped up in your own line of thinking. Okay, well, I want to sound impressive. I want to sound eloquent. I want to, use this to enhance my own image. Not really my goal, but those thoughts are then, they need to become embodied by the actual words that you put out. So you put them out and you see how they're received and how your listener receives them. And it really refines your ability not only to be a conversationalist, but just to be a human being. So my hope is that a lot of people, and like I said, in these younger generations are able to maybe participate in things like this, so that those immediate retreats to claims of violence and harm are less frequently and eagerly made. We're a little bit more robust and articulate and able to express ourselves. And that kind of touches on one of the big reasons I started this channel, and why I think you should accompany me in doing so and creating your own, because I think that along with all the other manifold things on which you've embarked, this would be a really, really good venue for you to express your diverse array of ideas.
Well, I really appreciate it. I appreciate the care with which you read the book, and I appreciate the substance and spirit of all of your answers. I actually think the left is a bigger offender on this than the right. I wish everybody understood that we can talk across and everybody will be okay.
Yeah, and I hope we're moving from the worst to a brighter and better day toward that place. So I think
cheers to that.
I think that is the perfect point at which to end. You've been more than generous with your time. You've given me a lot to think about. I might have to give Poison Ivy a rereading, but I'll certainly be recommending it, as I already have, to all my listeners and to all my family members and to friends at work. I think it's an excellent book. I will, of course, list all of your publications in the notes below. I told you already, and I'm sticking to this. I'm going right after Gwen Stefani and those dreams. So I'll be very excited to read that and to your other notes as well. Let me give the stage to you just for a minute as the stand-up comedian. Are there any other social media sites or platforms on which people can reach you?
Oh, I mean, I'm on Twitter. It's just at Evan Mandery, and I hate Twitter. And I have a webpage, and you know what? I'm easy to find. My email is easy to find through John Jay, and I think I've written back everybody who sends me. If it's a reasonably kind email, certainly if anybody's interested in having a thoughtful conversation, I always respond. And I really thank you for your time.
No, I thank you. You were more than generous, and I am one of those lucky beneficiaries of your response. Hopefully it was worth your while.
Oh, for sure.
And with that, I'll bid everyone farewell from Finneran's wake. Thank you for joining us today.